You guys, welcome to Wisdom Wednesday number 4. We are so happy you guys are back. We decided to come outside because it is so beautiful today and we're drinking our waters on the porch. It's really fun. Anyway, we're glad you're here with us. This is my awesome guest today,
Hi.
Lindsay, and she's a senior at Peace University, and she is here to join us because today we're going to be talking about something probably that most of us have had an experience with, and that is when you're just in this season of like you feel like God's told you something or you have a promise or you're wondering what the next step is, and you're just in this season of waiting for what you feel like God has for you, and that can be really tough sometimes. And so Lindsay is going to be here to share her story and maybe help us all connect our story to the one we have this week. So quick review of what we've already done in the first 3. You can go back and watch them for more details, but just to catch everybody up, remember we started out with the 4 major parts of the Bible: creation, the fall, restoration, and perfection. And we talked about how God was the main character of the story, and that we as human beings, men and women, girls and boys, we were made in God's image. We're the only creatures made in God's image, and that we were made for a worship relationship with Him. But we talked about in the second one, we talked about how doubt and distrust from Adam and Eve about who God was and His character led to the fall. So we've already gone through the first 2 parts. We're going to be in the fall for a while. And so the whole world was led into sin and suffering through that choice to turn away from God. God gives consequences. They have to leave the garden. But the good news is He does have a plan for our rescue. He doesn't reveal what the whole thing is yet, but there are glimpses of that at the beginning. So in the meantime, we talked about last week that sin had just gone crazy, had run rampant, and everybody was just doing all kinds of bad things. And so God just decides to start over, and He literally washes the sins of the world away, except for Noah and his family. And remember, they were on the boat and with 2 of every kind of animal, and so God rescued them. And you can watch Wisdom Wednesday number 3 to find out how that story really did relate. We had Casey and Bryn here last week, and it was really fun to hear how that story really was relevant today, even thousands of years later. It's pretty cool. So we're going to do that again today, but today we're talking about Abraham. Now, there are 2 major themes of this story that were in last week's story also, that you're going to see over and over and over again in Scripture. So I want to make sure you pick up on this when you're reading it. But trust and sacrifice, you're going to hear a lot about that as we go along. Now, remember we said Noah had been in our last story. 400 years have gone by now from Noah's death to Abram, who we see come into the story at the beginning of this week. And so there are some major, I know I gave you guys a lot of reading this week, but there are so many critical things about the reading that you had to understanding the whole story. It's like you will just miss kind of the crux of the whole main point if you don't see today's message or read the Scripture from this week. So let's start out by kind of going through that, and I'm going to ask Lindsay to help us out with some of the questions we have that we'll see where our story relates with this story, and she's going to share some of her story with us. All right, Genesis 12, 1 through 9 was the first part that you guys read. Remember, God called Abraham, or he was Abram at the time, to leave. He calls him to leave his family, his home, like everything he knew, like everything familiar, and he tells him to go somewhere. He doesn't really tell him where it is, and so he has no idea where God's actually taking him. So I had asked you guys this week, I'm going to ask Lindsay this question: has God ever called you to trust Him for something without you really knowing what the results were going to be?
Yeah, so some of you may know, you may have heard my story. I spoke at I Am More in Him Girls Conference this past
January.
month, the last month. And
she did a great job.
Thank you. I kind of talked about a little bit of my story, but recently, about a year ago, I was had this opportunity to go to Belize, and that was an awesome experience. But beforehand, a lot of people that don't know me didn't know that I kind of struggled with the decision to either go there or stay where it was more comfortable. I had the option to be an orientation leader at Peace, where I attend school, And I applied for that. I got the interview, and it just didn't end up working out. And so then Miss Kathy had posted about the Belize trip that she wanted everyone to go on, and I called her, and I was like, Miss Kathy, I really want to do this. It was only 2 months away at that time, so I was a little late to the party. But I was like, I don't know how all this is going to go, but I just want more information about it. And I just hoped that she could give me resources. So she was like, come on. So we ended up talking for a little bit, and I was very skeptical about how I was going to raise all the money that I had to raise, but it ended up working out, and I kind of just had to trust God's plan that if it was meant for me to go, there would be a way for me to go. And I ended up going, and while I was actually in Belize, my favorite song is Oceans by Hillsong, and on the first night, I had no idea this was happening, but we have worship every night in Belize, and the first song that Cameron and Lars and everyone that was playing music played was Oceans. And so that was just kind of a nod from God to let me know that that was where I was supposed to be in that exact moment.
That was awesome to share that with you.
Yeah.
And I think it's just such a testimony to sometimes God calls us out of our comfort zone.
Yeah.
And we have to be willing to like walk on the ocean, and like it feels like that sometimes, and trust Him for where He's taken us. And we may not even know exactly what all the details are, but we know He's trustworthy. And I think you really did. That was awesome to watch you walk on that water like that. It was cool. So, all right. So now, Genesis 15, we also read that, and that's where God made the promise to Abraham that he was going to have lots and lots of children. Lots and lots and lots and lots of children. He was going to be the father of many nations. But, you know, this was really weird because I think he was like 75 years old when God made this promise. And he had no children. So he's thinking, what in the world is this? Is just really weird. Yeah. But he believes God. And he believes that God is telling him the truth. And it says that when he believes Him, then God shows him also the other part of the promise, which is going to be the land that He's going to give all of those descendants, which we'll find out is called the promised land. And that's why, because it came through a promise from God. And so God has chosen that He's going to make Abraham the father of His chosen people, and He's going to provide a new place for them. Remember, they got kicked out of Eden, and now look, He's bringing them to a new place. And so there's just even a picture, a glimpse of God's restoration right there. Remember, that's going to be the third part of our story. It's just a foreshadowing of the real restoration that's coming. But anyway, God shows the depth of His love through that commitment, and He chooses to seal the relationship He has with Abram through what's called a covenant. And I wanted to tell you what that was, because sometimes you hear that word and you think, that's an old word. Like, we don't really think of it a lot of times. We don't talk about covenants in everyday life. So, but it's an agreement that can't be broken by anything other than death. It's permanent. It's supposed to be permanent. So, like, marriage is a covenant relationship. It's also always a relationship, an agreement based on a relationship. And so there's certain terms that go with that agreement, and that agreement can only be broken through death. And it's symbolized when the Hebrews would make a covenant, they would do what was called cutting a covenant. They didn't call it making one, they called it cutting it. And that's because they would use animals to sacrifice, to sort of represent that this covenant was a covenant of life. It was a lifetime covenant, and it would only be ended by death, which I thought was pretty interesting. So, and you know, you think about the blood of Christ and how this is getting ready to point us to that. So there's so many clues along the way, even though this is thousands of years before Jesus. The whole Bible really points to Him. So, anyway, then we moved to Genesis 17. And we read 1 through 22. And that's where, as part of this covenant and this new relationship, God gives Abram the new name of Abraham, and He gives his wife, who was called Sarai, her name is now Sarah. And so He changes their names sort of as a symbol to represent this new life and this covenant agreement. And He also has all the males circumcised, which we'll just sort of skip over that for now, but we might come back to that later. I know y'all want me to talk about that more, but we'll get back to that. Anyway, Genesis 22, 1 through 18, God has finally given Abraham the son that He has promised. Guess how long he had to wait from the time God promised him that son to the time it finally happened was 25 years. Like, that's longer than some of you guys have lived. That's longer than Lindsay's lived. Yeah. Not longer than I've lived, but we can pretend. Anyway.
A long time.
A long time. And so my next question for Lindsay, and for you guys to think about too, is Have you ever had to wait a long time for what you thought God had for you?
Yeah, so I'm currently still waiting. I am single, and I've been single for 22 years. I like to make that joke all the time. I never really had a boyfriend in high school, middle school, still don't have one. My whole big thing is that I'm waiting for the one that God has chosen for me. And so that's definitely been a tough time for me to kind of grasp onto and hold on to. But I know that somebody's out there for me, and I know that God has a plan for me, and I will continue to wait until He reveals His plan.
Yeah. What makes you able to wait like that?
Just knowing that He fulfills all of His promises and His covenants that He's made to each and every one of us. So it's definitely heartfelt and definitely good to know that He is going to fulfill His promises.
So it sounds like you really trust God as
I
far
do.
as in the waiting, and sometimes that's hard. I know.
It's
I've
very hard.
been there too, so I know. And maybe some of you guys are waiting for some things like that. Maybe even the same thing Lindsay's waiting.
Yeah.
You know, you know that God's got a plan for you, and so you're trusting Him in that waiting, and that can be a lonely and a hard place sometimes.
Yeah.
So we just want to encourage you that it's worth it, and just keep waiting, because God does have somebody, and He does, as we see with Abraham. Abraham waited 25 years, but God definitely fulfilled the promise in an awesome way. And so then God does something interesting in the very last part of your reading. That was to ask Abraham to sacrifice this only son that he had waited 25 years for. And Abraham actually takes these steps of obedience to be willing to lay down the very thing that he had waited for, that God wanted to see if Abraham would make that more important or more valuable than his relationship with God. And Abraham shows that he won't, and God provides a sacrifice. He does not end up having to sacrifice his son Isaac. But God wanted to see, He was testing his faith to see if his faith would really, if he'd keep God as his first, his most, and his best, because he knew that if he would be obedient in that testing, that there would be a deeper relationship. And so I wanted to ask Lindsay, and you guys might think of this too, is have you ever felt like God's tested you?
Yeah, so I have chills when she's talking about it. But Miss Kathy might not even know this. I don't think she does.
Surprise us.
Gonna surprise you all. Actually, I said earlier how I've been single for 22 years, and the new 50 Shades movie just came out, which is very controversial in the Christian faith and all over the world. And I was kind of debating if I wanted to go see it or not. I have seen the first two, so I do know what they're about. But I was sitting in church one Sunday, and my pastor started talking about 50 Shades. And immediately I heard a voice in my head, and it said, Lindsay, if you don't go see this movie, and if you kind of stay true to who you are and have faith in me, I will bless you in your life. And so I have not seen the new 50 Shades movie, and I'm kind of trusting Him. And I feel like that was kind of a test for God to see if I would stay faithful and trust in Him, and if I want Him to bless me in my life and my future relationships. So that was a test that I'm hopefully still following, and hopefully continue to follow.
Yeah. Well, lots of times there are moral tests that God gives, but the reason, so there's a difference I want to make sure you understand, and we're going to wrap it up with this, but there's a difference in testing and tempting. Like, God tests us in order to deepen our trust with Him, so that our relationship with Him will deepen, so that our intimacy with Him will grow, and so that He can be glorified through that. But Satan tempts us with the motivation and the purpose of seeing us fail and fall. And he does that in order to pull us away from God, just like he did for Eve, and just like he wants to do through so many choices we have to make, especially in our culture today. So, just make sure you understand that. Like, God doesn't ever tempt us, but he does test our faith, and there's a good purpose in his. So God's testing is to draw us closer to himself. Satan's temptation is to pull us away from God. But anyway, if you are in the waiting at this season in your life, and you're having to wait for something, just send us a message or let us know, and we can pray for you. And we're really glad that you joined us this week. And remember whose you are and who you are, and let that set the standards and choices for your life. We love you guys. We'll see you next week.